September 8, 1944. A young British soldier named Bernard Browning hurried through the streets of western London, eager to catch a train to see his girlfriend. The city hummed with cautious optimism. Allied forces had driven the Germans nearly out of France. Soviet armies pressed from the east. Brussels had just been liberated. After 5 long years, victory seemed within reach. Browning checked his watch and quickened his pace. At precisely 6:40 in the evening, without any warning whatsoever, the world exploded. No air raid siren, no engine noise, no indication that death was falling from the sky. A massive detonation tore through Staveley Road in Chiswick, carving a 20-foot crater in the earth. 11 houses vanished in an instant. 27 more suffered severe damage. Windows shattered for blocks in every direction. And Bernard Browning, along with 2 others, would never see their loved ones again. The British government immediately attempted to cover up what had just happened. They blamed the explosion on defective gas mains, hoping to prevent panic. But Londoners weren't fooled. They had survived the Blitz. They knew the difference between a gas explosion and something far more sinister. Soon, dark humor spread through the streets as people began calling these new weapons flying gas pipes, because what had just struck London was no ordinary bomb. It was the world's first ballistic missile, traveling faster than sound itself. A weapon so advanced that it would influence rocket design for the next 80 years. Adolf Hitler had promised his people Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, that would turn the tide of the war. For months, Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had stoked German hopes with claims of coming superweapons that would exact Vergeltung, vengeance, for the relentless Allied bombing of German cities. The people of London, Antwerp, and other Allied cities were about to discover that some of these promises were terrifyingly real. The Third Reich, facing inevitable defeat on multiple fronts, had bet heavily on technological superiority to change the course of the war. German engineers and scientists had pushed the boundaries of what was possible, creating weapons that ranged from the ingenious to the desperate. Some of these weapons would prove revolutionary, influencing military technology for decades to come. Others would demonstrate the futility of technological solutions to strategic disasters. But all of them would carry a terrible human cost, paid not just by their victims, but by the thousands of slave laborers who died building them. This is the story of Hitler's secret weapons, the rockets that fell from space, the jet fighters that could outrun anything in the sky, the atomic bomb that never was, the tanks that struck fear into Allied crews, and the submarines that revolutionized underwater warfare. These weapons represented both the pinnacle of German engineering and the catastrophic failure of Nazi leadership. They came too late to change the outcome of the war, but their shadows would stretch across the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The fear they generated among Allied leaders was real and profound. Winston Churchill seriously considered dropping poison gas on German cities in response to the rocket attacks. General Dwight Eisenhower worried that German jet fighters might make the invasion of Europe impossible. The Manhattan Project raced against time, driven by the nightmare scenario of Hitler acquiring nuclear weapons first. These weren't abstract fears, they were based on hard intelligence about real German capabilities that, in some cases, exceeded anything the Allies possessed. Yet for all their sophistication, these wonder weapons ultimately demonstrated a fundamental truth about warfare. No amount of technological superiority can overcome strategic incompetence, industrial insufficiency, and moral bankruptcy. The same regime that produced the world's first jet fighter and ballistic missile also drove away its best scientists, squandered resources on competing projects, and built its most advanced weapons with the forced labor of concentration camp prisoners who died by the thousands. The story of Hitler's secret weapons is ultimately a story about the relationship between technology and power, innovation and ethics, genius and madness. It's about brilliant minds working in service of an evil cause, creating marvels that killed indiscriminately. And it's about how the very weapons meant to save the Third Reich may have actually hastened its defeat by draining resources that could have been used more effectively elsewhere. As we explore each of these weapons in detail, examining their development, capabilities, and impact, we'll discover that the real wonder wasn't the weapons themselves, but the fact that Nazi Germany came as close as it did to fielding technologies that could have fundamentally altered the balance of power. And we'll understand why the world's democracies, having witnessed what totalitarian regimes could accomplish with such weapons, would spend the next half-century ensuring they maintained technological superiority in the arms race that followed. The Vengeance rocket's terror from above. The Peenemünde Army Research Center stood on a remote stretch of Baltic coastline in northeastern Germany, far from the prying eyes of enemy reconnaissance. Beginning in 1936, this facility grew into something unprecedented, a technological city dedicated to a single purpose, turning rockets from experimental novelties into practical weapons of war. By the early 1940s, Peenemünde had its own airport and seaport, production facilities, hundreds of apartment buildings for thousands of scientists, multiple missile launch pads, a power plant, and a wind tunnel capable of reaching speeds of Mach 4.4. The facility's rail network became the third largest in Germany, behind only Berlin and Hamburg. At the center of this technological marvel was a young engineer named Wernher von Braun. From childhood, von Braun had been fascinated by spaceflight and rockets. At age 18, he began university studies in engineering, and by December 1932, he had started his doctoral work on liquid-fueled rockets, while simultaneously joining the German Army's secret rocket program. The timing was ominous. Just 1 month later, Adolf Hitler would be appointed Chancellor of Germany. Intelligent, charismatic, and an exceptionally skilled administrator, von Braun quickly became the driving force behind Germany's rocket development. He was a man who dreamed of reaching the stars, but found himself building weapons to rain death upon cities. The path to the V-2 rocket began with a series of experimental designs called the aggregate series. Each iteration, designated A1, A2, A3, and so on, solved new technical challenges. How do you build an engine powerful enough yet efficient enough to propel a 12-ton rocket? What aerodynamic shape allows supersonic flight without the rocket tumbling out of control? How do you stabilize and guide such a vehicle? These weren't theoretical questions. They were engineering problems that required practical solutions, and von Braun's team worked through them methodically. Initially, Hitler showed little interest in rockets. Why invest in what essentially amounted to expensive artillery shells when his blitzkrieg tactics were delivering lightning victories across Europe? For the first 2 years of the war, the rocket program received minimal support. But by the end of 1941, everything had changed. German forces had been repulsed from the gates of Moscow. The Soviet Union had proven far more resilient than anticipated. The United States had entered the war on the Allied side. Suddenly, unconventional weapons that might break the strategic stalemate looked far more attractive. On October 3, 1942, at Peenemünde, history was made. The A-4 rocket, later redesignated the V-2, completed its first fully successful test flight, reaching an altitude of 52 miles before arcing down to impact its target area. Walter Dornberger, the military officer overseeing the program, declared to the assembled engineers and officials, "This 3rd day of October, 1942, is the first of a new era in transportation, that of space travel." It was a moment of triumph, the successful culmination of years of work, but it was also the birth of a weapon that would kill thousands of civilians. The V-2 stood as tall as a 4-story building, a sleek 46 feet of metal that looked like something from science fiction. Its sophisticated guidance system used an onboard gyroscope to maintain trajectory. The rocket would climb straight up, powered by a motor burning a mixture of alcohol water and liquid oxygen, accelerating to speeds exceeding 3,500 miles per hour. At the peak of its ballistic arc, having left Earth's atmosphere and reached the edge of space, the engine would cut off. The missile would then arc over and plummet back toward its target, falling faster than the speed of sound, carrying 1 ton of high explosive in its warhead. This was the truly terrifying aspect of the V-2. Because it traveled faster than sound, there was no warning. Unlike conventional bombers that could be heard approaching, or even the V-1 flying bomb with its distinctive buzzing engine, the V-2 struck before anyone knew it was coming. The first indication of an attack was the explosion itself. Only afterward would observers hear the roar of the rocket's descent. This psychological impact was exactly what Hitler wanted. These weren't precision weapons meant to destroy military targets. They were terror weapons designed to break civilian morale. The V-1 flying bomb, which came before the V-2, was a different beast entirely, but equally sinister in its purpose. About 25 feet long, with a wingspan of roughly 20 feet, the V-1 was essentially a pilotless aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine. That engine created a distinctive buzzing sound that earned the weapon its nickname, the Buzz Bomb or Doodlebug. Launched from catapult ramps in northern France, the V-1 would fly straight and level at about 360 miles per hour until it ran out of fuel and inevitably crashed. It carried an 1,870-pound warhead and had a range of about 150 miles. On June 13, 1944, just 1 week after D-Day, the first V-1 attack was launched against London. 10 missiles were fired. 4 reached England. The first struck near Swanscombe, causing no casualties. But the second destroyed a bridge at Bethnal Green, killing 6 people and injuring 9 others. It was the beginning of a campaign that would send thousands of these weapons against British and Belgian targets. The V-1 had one crucial vulnerability. It was slow enough to be intercepted. British defenses soon adapted. Anti-aircraft guns were repositioned along the North Downs and the southeastern coast, forming a defensive barrier. Fast RAF fighters learned to shoot the missiles down or, in a remarkable display of skill and nerve, to fly alongside them and tip their wings with their own wingtips, sending the bombs tumbling off course into unpopulated areas. By August 1944, British defenses were destroying over half the V-1s before they reached their targets. But there was no defense against the V-2. Its supersonic speed made interception impossible with World War II technology. The only countermeasures were to bomb the launch sites or to feed false information to German intelligence about where the missiles were landing, hoping to make them adjust their aim incorrectly. Through the British double-cross system, which secretly controlled the German espionage network in Britain, Allied intelligence was able to convince the Germans to aim V-1s and V-2s at less populated areas east of London rather than the city center. This deception saved countless lives, though its full extent wouldn't be revealed until after the war. From September 1944 until March 1945, Germany launched over 3,000 PK-2 rockets against Allied targets, primarily London and Antwerp. The missiles killed approximately 5,000 civilians. One particularly devastating strike occurred on November 25, 1944, when a V-2 exploded at a Woolworth store on New Cross Road in London, killing 168 people and seriously injuring 121 others. The shoppers never knew what hit them. One moment, they were going about their daily business. The next, they were simply gone. The production of these weapons, however, exacted an even greater toll than their deployment. After Allied bombing damaged facilities at Peenemünde, the Germans moved production to an underground factory complex called Mittelbau-Dora in central Germany. This wasn't just a factory. It was a concentration camp where prisoners were worked to death, building Hitler's wonder weapons. The conditions were beyond horrific. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts excavating tunnels in the Kohnstein Mountain, breathing rock dust and toxic fumes from the blasting. They slept underground for months at a time, never seeing sunlight. Sanitation consisted of oil barrels cut in half. The stench became unbearable. Disease ran rampant through the tunnels. Of the approximately 60,000 prisoners who passed through Mittelbau-Dora and its subcamps, between 20,000 and 25,000 died. That means more people died building V-2 rockets than were killed by them. This wasn't a side effect of weapons production. It was systematic murder through labor, with death rates deliberately maximized through starvation, disease, and brutal working conditions. The prisoners weren't just building rockets. They were being exterminated while doing so. American infantryman John Ryson Jones, Jr. would later photograph the horrors he witnessed when Allied forces liberated the camp in April 1945. His shaking hands captured images of emaciated bodies, of men who had been worked to death for the sake of von Braun's rockets. Wernher von Braun knew about the conditions at Mittelbau-Dora. He had visited the facility multiple times. After the war, he would claim ignorance of the full extent of the atrocities, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Yet this same man, whose rockets were built by slave labor at the cost of thousands of lives, would be welcomed to America as part of Operation Paperclip, the secret program to recruit German scientists. He would go on to become the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket that sent Americans to the moon. The moral complexities of this arrangement would haunt both von Braun and the American space program for decades. Did the V weapons achieve their strategic objective? Not even remotely. They failed to break British morale. They didn't prevent the D-Day invasion. They didn't force the Allies to divert significant resources from the main war effort, though they did cause the Allies to bomb launch sites and production facilities. What the V weapons did accomplish was to drain resources from Germany's desperately overstretched war economy. Each V-2 cost as much as a bomber aircraft, but delivered far less destructive power and could only be used once. The program consumed materials, labor, and industrial capacity that could have been used to produce more conventional weapons that might have had a greater impact on the actual fighting. Historians have argued ever since about what would have happened if the V weapons had been ready earlier. Could they have disrupted the D-Day preparations? Might they have forced Britain to negotiate? Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, claimed after the war that the weapons could have been operational much sooner if they had received proper support. But this misses the fundamental point. By the time Germany felt desperate enough to embrace these wonder weapons, the strategic situation had already become hopeless. No amount of technological innovation could overcome the massive industrial and manpower advantages the Allies possessed by 1943 and 1944. The V-2 rocket's true legacy wasn't its effectiveness as a weapon of war, it was the technology itself. After Germany's surrender, both the United States and the Soviet Union scrambled to capture V-2 rockets. Documentation, production facilities, and the scientists who had created them. The Americans succeeded in bringing von Braun and about 1,600 other German scientists to the United States through Operation Paperclip. The Soviets forcibly relocated approximately 6,000 German scientists and their families to Russian rocket facilities. The space race of the 1960s and 1970s, the intercontinental ballistic missiles of the Cold War, the entire modern era of rocketry traces its lineage directly back to the V-2, designed at Peenemünde. Standing in that Woolworth's on New Cross Road on November 25, 1944, shoppers had no idea they were being killed by the ancestor of the rockets that would eventually take humanity to the moon. The same technology that represented one of the darkest chapters of World War II would, a quarter-century later, fulfill von Braun's childhood dream of spaceflight. It's a reminder that technology itself is morally neutral. It's the purposes to which we put it that determine whether it becomes an instrument of horror or achievement. The Jet Revolution. Messerschmitt Me 262. On a bright morning in October 1944, Allied bomber crews preparing for another raid over Germany caught sight of something that made them question their eyes. A German aircraft flashed past their formations at a speed that seemed impossible. It had no propeller. The sleek, swept-wing design looked like nothing they had encountered before. Before the escorts could react, the strange aircraft attacked, its four 30mm cannons shredding a B-17 bomber in a single devastating pass. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone, accelerating away at a speed no conventional fighter could match. The age of jet combat had arrived, and for Allied aircrews it was terrifying. The Messerschmitt Me-262, nicknamed Schwalbe or Swallow in its fighter variant, represented a quantum leap in aviation technology. With a top speed of approximately 540 miles per hour, it was about 120 miles per hour faster than the finest Allied fighters like the P-51 Mustang or the Spitfire. In the hands of a skilled pilot, the Me-262 was nearly untouchable. It could engage or disengage from combat at will. Allied fighters simply couldn't catch it. British test pilot Eric Brown, who flew 487 different aircraft types during his career and would later test captured German jets, called the Me-262 the most formidable aircraft of World War II. The Me-262's development began surprisingly early. In April 1939, before the war even started, Willy Messerschmitt received an official commission from the Luftwaffe to design a jet-powered fighter. The concept was revolutionary. While Britain, the United States, and other nations were also investigating jet propulsion, Germany had a significant head start. But the path from concept to operational aircraft would prove far longer and more complicated than anyone anticipated. The first Me-262 prototype flew on April 18, 1941, but it used a conventional piston engine because the intended jet engines weren't ready. The first jet-powered flight wouldn't occur until July 18, 1942, when test pilot Fritz Wendel, took the aircraft up, using the new Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines. Even then, the aircraft was far from combat ready. The jet engines were revolutionary, but they were also temperamental, unreliable, and consumed fuel at an alarming rate. What followed was a period of development plagued by interference from the highest levels of the Nazi regime. In May 1943, Adolf Hitler attended a demonstration of the Me-262. Despite some mechanical failures during the test flight, Hitler was impressed, but his vision for the aircraft diverged sharply from what the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots needed. Hitler, thinking offensively rather than defensively, insisted that the Me-262 be developed primarily as a fast bomber to strike at the Allied invasion forces he knew were coming. This was exactly the opposite of what Germany actually required. What the Luftwaffe desperately needed in 1943 and 1944 was a fighter interceptor to defend German cities from the massive Allied bombing campaign that was systematically destroying German industry. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most successful fighter aces and a leading voice in the Luftwaffe, fought vigorously against Hitler's bomber fixation. Galland understood that the Me-262's greatest potential lay in attacking the formations of American B-17 and B-24 bombers that appeared over Germany almost daily. The jet's speed would allow it to penetrate the screen of escort fighters, and its four 30-millimeter cannons, firing highly destructive shells, could tear apart a bomber in a single pass. But Hitler refused to budge. Approximately 30% of Me-262 production was diverted to the Me-262 A2A Sturmvogel or Stormbird variant, configured as a fighter bomber. Even without Hitler's meddling, the Me-262 faced serious technical challenges. The Junkers Jumo 004 engines were the heart of the problem. Germany's war economy lacked many of the specialty metals needed for reliable jet engines. Nickel and chromium, essential for components that had to withstand incredible heat and stress, were in desperately short supply. As a result, the engines were unreliable and short-lived. On average, a Jumo 004 engine lasted less than 5 hours before requiring replacement. Later in the war, as materials became even scarcer, engines sometimes failed even before completing their initial test runs. The jet engines also had operational quirks that made them dangerous in combat. The compressor had to be brought up to speed gradually before the turbine could be ignited. This meant that throttle response was slow. A pilot couldn't simply jam the throttle forward for a burst of speed. The engines took several seconds to spool up. In a dogfight, those seconds could be fatal. Additionally, if one engine failed or was damaged, the Me-262 couldn't easily outrun Allied fighters. It became vulnerable, and pilots had to race for the nearest friendly airfield, hoping the enemy wouldn't catch them. Despite these limitations, in skilled hands, the Me-262 was devastating. German pilots developed tactics that maximized the jet's advantages while minimizing its weaknesses. They would approach Allied bomber formations in a shallow dive, building up speed, then blast through the formation with their 30-millimeter cannons blazing. The high closing speed made it almost impossible for Allied gunners to track them. After the attack, they would zoom away before the escort fighters could intercept. The key was to avoid getting drawn into turning dogfights with more maneuverable piston engine fighters. The Me-262's armament was fearsome. The 430-millimeter Mk-108 cannons were the most powerful weapons fitted to any production fighter of the war. A single hit from one of these cannon shells could destroy a fighter aircraft. A few hits could bring down a heavy bomber. Some Me-262 variants were also equipped with R-4M rockets, wire-guided missiles that could be fired in salvos at bomber formations. When everything worked correctly, an Me-262 could wreak havoc on Allied air operations. On March 18, 1945, 37 Me-262s intercepted a massive force of 1,221 bombers, escorted by 632 fighters. During the engagement, the German jets shot down 12 bombers and 1 fighter while losing far fewer of their own aircraft. It was exactly the kind of performance that validated the jet fighter concept. German pilots claimed the Me-262 shot down 542 Allied aircraft during the war, though this number remains disputed and was likely inflated by the fog of war and overclaiming. But statistics on paper couldn't change the strategic reality. By the time the Me-262 entered service in meaningful numbers in 1944, Germany was already losing the war. The Allies had achieved air superiority over Europe. They could afford to lose bombers at a rate that would have been unthinkable for Germany. And crucially, the Allies quickly learned the Me-262's vulnerabilities. The jets were most vulnerable during takeoff and landing, when they couldn't use their speed advantage. Allied fighters began patrolling the known jet bases, waiting for Me-262s to land when their fuel was exhausted. This tactic, though dangerous due to heavy German anti-aircraft defenses around the airfields, paid substantial dividends. Production numbers tell the story of missed opportunity. Messerschmitt factories produced 1,443 Me-262s during the war, but only about 300 ever saw combat. The rest were destroyed in Allied bombing raids, lot in training accidents, or sat idle for lack of fuel, spare parts, or trained pilots. There were probably never more than 36 Me-262s in the air at one time, facing Allied air armadas of thousands of aircraft. Even with revolutionary technology, the numbers were simply too lopsided. After the war, captured Me-262s became prizes for the victorious powers. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union all studied the German jets intensively. The aircraft's design influenced the next generation of fighters on both sides of the emerging Cold War. The American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15, the jets that would clash in the skies over Korea just a few years later. Both incorporated lessons learned from the Me-262. The swept-wing design, the pod-mounted engines, the overall layout, these elements became standard features of jet fighters for decades. The Me-262 raises one of the great what-if questions of World War II. What if Hitler hadn't insisted on the bomber variant? What if the jet engines had been more reliable? What if production had started a year earlier? Galland and other German officers claimed after the war that the Me-262 could have been operational a year to 18 months sooner if it had received proper priority and support. Could it have prevented the Allies from achieving air superiority? Could it have made the D-Day invasion impossible? The consensus among historians is that while earlier deployment of the Me-262 might have caused the Allies greater casualties, it couldn't have changed the war's outcome. Germany simply lacked the resources to produce the jets in sufficient numbers, train enough pilots, and provide adequate fuel and maintenance. The same strategic overextension and resource shortages that doomed the V weapons would have doomed a larger Me-262 program. What the Me-262 might have done if deployed in 1943 with several hundred operational aircraft was force the Allies to reconsider or delay their daylight bombing campaign over Germany. That would have given German industry breathing room and possibly prolonged the war. But ultimate victory for Germany, that was beyond the reach of any wonder weapon. The real wonder of the Me-262 wasn't that it existed, but that German engineers created such an advanced aircraft under the conditions they faced. Systematic Allied bombing was destroying German factories. Critical materials were scarce. Skilled labor was being drained away by military conscription. Yet somehow, working under these impossible conditions, German engineers produced the world's first operational jet fighter. It was a remarkable achievement. It was also, ultimately, futile. Luftwaffe pilot Hans Guido Moltke, flying an Me-262 on April 9, 1945, believed he broke the sound barrier during a steep dive to protect another jet from attack. Whether he actually achieved supersonic flight in the Me-262 has never been confirmed and remains controversial. But the claim, true or not, demonstrates the performance envelope these aircraft operated in. They were pushing the boundaries of what was aerodynamically possible with the technology of the 1940s. 2 weeks after that flight, Moltke landed his Me-262 in Dubendorf, Switzerland, claiming he had lost his way during a mission. Others suspected he was actually defecting as the Reich collapsed around him. The Swiss didn't try to fly the aircraft. They preserved it in storage until returning it to Germany in 1957. It's one of only 9 Me-262s that survive in museums around the world today, tangible reminders of the jet age's violent birth. Standing before one of these surviving aircraft in a museum, it's impossible not to feel a mixture of admiration for the engineering achievement and somber reflection on what it represented. This wasn't just a technological marvel. It was a weapon built by a regime fighting for its survival, a regime responsible for unprecedented atrocities. The same industrial capacity that produced the Me-262 was complicit in genocide. The same engineers who solved the problems of jet propulsion worked alongside those designing more efficient methods of mass murder. The Me-262 demonstrated that technological superiority alone cannot win wars. Strategy, resources, industrial capacity, logistics, morale, all of these factors matter just as much or more than having the best weapons. Germany produced the world's first jet fighter, but it lost the war anyway. The lesson wasn't lost on the nations that would dominate the post-war world. Technological advantage mattered, yes, but only as part of a broader strategic, economic, and industrial framework. The Cold War arms race that followed would be characterized by both sides working desperately to maintain or achieve technological edges, but always in the context of comprehensive military and industrial might. The atomic shadow, Germany's nuclear program. On the evening of August 6, 1945, in a comfortable country house near Cambridge, England, 10 German scientists were having dinner when they heard a radio broadcast that stunned them into silence. The BBC announcer reported that an atomic bomb had been dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Werner Heisenberg, one of the most brilliant quantum physicists of the 20th century, initially dismissed the report. Without hearing the words uranium or nuclear fission, he insisted it must be something else. Otto Hahn, the chemist who had discovered nuclear fission in Berlin in 1938, was devastated. "If the Americans have an uranium bomb," he said, "then you're all second-raters." These scientists didn't know that their conversation was being recorded. The British had secretly bugged Farm Hall, the manor house, where they were being held as part of Operation Epsilon. Allied intelligence wanted to determine exactly how close Nazi Germany had come to building an atomic bomb. The transcripts of their shock discussions over the following days revealed that the German nuclear program had never come close to producing a weapon. Heisenberg had calculated that building a bomb would require approximately a ton of enriched uranium-235. He was wrong by a factor of about 10. The actual critical mass was less than 100 pounds. This miscalculation, whether a genuine error or deliberate sabotage by Heisenberg, had profound implications for the German program. The fear of a Nazi atomic bomb had driven the Allied nuclear program from its inception. In August 1939, Albert Einstein, himself a refugee from Nazi Germany, had written to President Franklin Roosevelt warning that it may become possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium by which vast amounts of power and large quantities of new radium-like elements would be generated. Einstein was urging Roosevelt to begin an American atomic program before Germany could complete one. The fear was existential. Whoever possessed atomic weapons first might win the war and dominate the post-war world. Germany had significant advantages at the start. German physicists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had discovered nuclear fission in late 1938. Germany had a strong industrial base, access to uranium, and some of the world's best scientists. The German nuclear program, codenamed Uranverein or Uranium Club, began in April 1939, giving them a substantial head start over the Manhattan Project. So, what went wrong? The problems began with the Nazi regime itself. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he immediately began driving Jewish scientists out of German universities and research institutions. Physics was particularly hard hit. The Nazis even promoted the concept of Deutsche Physik, or German physics, rejecting certain theories like relativity as Jewish physics. This wasn't just ideologically driven nonsense. It was self-inflicted brain drain. Albert Einstein, Lise Meitner, Otto Frisch, Niels Bohr, Danish but threatened by Nazi occupation, and many other brilliant minds fled Germany and Nazi-controlled territories. Many of them would end up working on the Manhattan Project, using their expertise to build the atomic bomb for the Allies. By 1942, the German nuclear program was operating under multiple uncoordinated groups with no central leadership. Different organizations, the Army Ordnance Office, the Reich Research Council, the Postal Service, all had competing programs with overlapping goals. This wasn't the focused, well-funded, centrally managed Manhattan Project with its $2 billion budget and 130,000 workers. This was a fractured effort hamstrung by bureaucratic infighting and lack of clear priority. In June 1942, Werner Heisenberg and other scientists briefed Armaments Minister Albert Speer about the potential of nuclear weapons. According to Speer's post-war account, Heisenberg did not encourage him about the short-term possibilities. Heisenberg didn't request a massive increase in funding. He didn't paint a picture of a war-winning weapon just around the corner. Speer, facing the challenge of keeping Germany's conventional military equipped as the war turned against them, concluded that nuclear weapons couldn't be ready in time to affect the war's outcome. He decided to concentrate resources on the more promising rocket and jet projects that could be operational sooner. This assessment was probably correct given the state of German nuclear research. The Germans never achieved a sustained nuclear chain reaction, something Enrico Fermi accomplished in Chicago in December 1942. They never built a working nuclear reactor. Their final attempt, a small experimental reactor in a cave in Haigerloch in southern Germany, never reached criticality. By the spring of 1945, when the American nuclear program was reaching culmination with the first atomic test just weeks away, the German program consisted of that experimental reactor and a collection of scientists who lacked both the theoretical understanding and the practical materials to build a bomb. The German approach to moderating the nuclear reaction was flawed from the start. To initiate a controlled chain reaction in a nuclear reactor, you need a moderator to slow down neutrons. The Germans focused on heavy water, deuterium oxide, as their moderator, rather than graphite, which the Americans used. This decision led them to depend on heavy water produced at the Norsk hydro plant in Nazi-occupied Norway. When Allied intelligence learned of this, Norwegian resistance fighters conducted daring sabotage operations against the facility, operations later dramatized in the 1965 film The Heroes of Telemark. These raids successfully disrupted heavy water production and shipments, further setting back the German program. The ALSO's mission, established in 1943, was the Allied intelligence operation tasked with tracking the German nuclear program. Led scientifically by Samuel Gudschmidt, the mission followed closely behind advancing Allied forces, seizing documents, equipment, and personnel. In November 1944, Gudschmidt had gathered enough evidence to conclude that there was no German atomic bomb under development, but many in America remained skeptical. The fear persisted until Allied forces actually captured the German facilities and scientists. In April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, a small American force, codenamed Operation Big, penetrated deep into Germany on a dangerous mission to capture Heisenberg and the other top nuclear scientists before they could fall into Soviet hands. On April 24th, they found a textile mill that had been converted into a nuclear research laboratory. Interrogating the scientists, they learned that research files hadn't been destroyed as claimed, but were sealed in a watertight drum and sunk in a cesspool. After a disgusting retrieval operation, they recovered the documents. They also found Heisenberg's experimental reactor and the uranium pile buried in a nearby field. But Heisenberg himself had fled a week earlier, traveling by train and bicycle to join his family in Bavaria. The Americans eventually caught up with him in a village called Urfeld. He surrendered without incident. Along with 9 other top German nuclear scientists, Heisenberg was taken to Farm Hall for 6 months of comfortable internment and secret surveillance. The recordings from Farm Hall revealed complex emotions among the German scientists. Some, like Otto Hahn, expressed relief that Germany hadn't built a bomb for Hitler. Others, particularly Walter Gerlach and Kurt Diebner, were dismayed at having failed. Over the following weeks, some of the scientists developed what has been called the Lessart, a version of events that suggested they had deliberately dragged their feet or sabotaged the program to prevent Hitler from getting nuclear weapons. Modern historians largely reject this narrative. The evidence suggests the Germans failed because of scientific mistakes, lack of resources, bureaucratic mismanagement, and the absence of the massive industrial commitment that characterized the Manhattan Project. The what-if scenario of a Nazi atomic bomb is perhaps the most nightmarish of all World War II alternative histories. If Germany had succeeded, If they had detonated even a single atomic bomb over London or Moscow or an Allied invasion force, the consequences are almost unthinkable. Would Britain have sued for peace? Would the Soviet Union have collapsed? Would the Allies have been willing to invade a nuclear-armed Germany? These questions have haunted historians and spawned countless speculative scenarios. But the reality is that Germany never came close. The combination of flawed scientific leadership, Nazi ideology driving away top talent, lack of centralized support, shortage of critical materials, and the successful Allied campaign of bombing and sabotage meant that the German nuclear program remained frozen at the laboratory level. The nightmare scenario never materialized. The first atomic bombs would be American, and they would be used against Japan, not by Germany against the Allies. After the war, both superpowers scrambled to acquire German nuclear scientists and materials, just as they did with rocket technology. Many German scientists ended up working on Soviet or American nuclear programs. But unlike the rocket scientists, who could directly apply their knowledge to new projects, the nuclear scientists had less immediate impact because they simply hadn't achieved the breakthroughs their Allied counterparts had. The German nuclear program's failure stands as a powerful counterpoint to the myth of Nazi scientific superiority. Yes, Germany produced rockets and jet fighters and advanced submarines, but in the most important technological race of the war, the race to harness the power of the atom, they failed completely. And that failure may have saved millions of lives and changed the course of human history.